Good evening, Master Gardeners. My name is Will Redfern, and I want to welcome all of our fellow Master Gardeners from the Southside units, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Portsmouth, and Suffolk. We are super excited to have you join us tonight. This event tonight is actually a monthly membership meeting for us here in Norfolk. We usually start with a guest speaker and then afterward have a business portion of the meeting. So that is what we will be doing tonight. We are also having Kathleen Reed, our state coordinator, as our guest speaker in November, and we look forward to inviting all of you to that as well. For tonight, because of the size of the audience, we have muted everybody, so please put your questions into the chat box. We have also turned off your video screens. In addition, we have turned on the live transcript feature. If you don't want the closed captioning, simply turn it off by using the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So now I'm going to turn it over to our Vice President, Kim Swecker, to introduce tonight's speaker.
I also join Will in welcoming all of our Southside Hampton Roads Master Gardener units. Our speaker this evening is Doug Tallamy, and for most of us, he needs no introduction. But in case you're new to his accomplishments, here's a brief list of some of the highlights of his impressive career. Doug Tallamy is a T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. At the university, he authored 106 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 41 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His books include Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller, and The Nature of Oaks, winner of the American Horticultural Society's 2022 Book Award. In 2021, he co-founded Homegrown National Park with Michelle Alfandari. His awards include recognition from the Garden Writers Association, Audubon Society, National Wildlife Federation, Allegheny College, the Garden Club of America, and the American Horticultural Association. His presentation this evening is Homegrown National Park, which is a movement that identifies the deficiency of our current parks and wildlife areas in supporting a sustainable ecosystem. It's a call to action to all of us to create a diverse ecosystem in our own backyards, no matter how small they are. Well, I'm tired of hearing myself talk, and I'm sure you are. It's time to pass the keyboard to our guest, Doug Tallamy.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. I do want to talk about my idea of Homegrown National Park today, but before I do that, let's take a walk through my yard. Oh, looks like a blob on a leaf there. That's actually a bola spider, kind of mimicking a fecal sac. You know, birds pick up the poops from their babies and they fly out of the nest and then they drop it somewhere. So that's what that looks like. But at night, that spider hangs off the leaf and goes hunting. It drops a single strand of silk with a sticky glob of glue at the end and goes fishing with it. Sometimes they get carried away and they make a trap line with a lot of sticky globs of glue. But what they do is catch moths with that sticky glob glue. It's hard to believe that they would, but they do. They catch it, then they spin it around, wrap it all up with silk, and they have themselves a good meal. Once they have had several good meals, they construct an egg mass out of silk, and if they continue to feed well, they'll make several egg masses. So how can they actually catch a moth with that little glob of glue? Well, it turns out they're actually releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moths. And at my yard, it is the bronze cutworm. So every moth that they catch in my yard is a male bronze cutworm that thinks she's a female. He comes in to mate with her, and she has a good meal. So I have bronze cutworms because I've got the bronze cutworm caterpillars in my yard, and I've got bronze cutworms caterpillars because I've got goldenrod. That's their primary host plant. I got dot line white moths, beautiful little moths, because I've got white oaks that are in my yard. This is the one right in my front yard. That is their host plant. And I have those moths because when the leaves drop, I don't rake them away. If I did, that's the cocoon right there of that dot line white. I would throw it away. Here it is a little bit enlarged, but there's no way you would see that as you're raking your leaves. I've got evening primrose moths because I've got evening primrose. The moth comes and spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it gets crowded in there, but it's a sight that I enjoy seeing. I've got zebra swallowtails because I've got pawpaws. It would take me, I didn't want to do that. Excuse me. It would take me a week at least to describe all of the species that now call my property home. It would not take me that long to describe what's happening in a landscape like this, particularly in the front. Very little is happening. There's no goldenrod, so there's no bronze cutworms, so there's no bola spiders. There's no oak tree, so there's no dot line white. There's no evening primrose, so there's no evening primrose moth. There's no pawpaws, so there's no zebra swallowtails, and on and on and on. In fact, there's very little that can live in a typical landscape, and we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes in the US. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. They're already gone. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is gone. 1 million species face extinction, according to the UN. 40% of the Earth's plants face extinction. Not good news at all. And that's why Elizabeth Colbert gets to write a book about the 6th great extinction. So if you want to be depressed, read Elizabeth's book. Jason Hickel says biodiversity loss, but the type we're just talking about here is such a strange euphemism for the mass destruction of non-human beings, which we are doing at an alarming rate. Martin Tye says that humans have proven they are incapable of taking over planetary management from nature. Nature believes in balance, humans believe in endless growth. Only one is right, and we know which one that is. This is a map of the distribution of the areas with the greatest number of species that are threatened. So a whole lot in the southeast here, a whole lot in the west, but there are species threatened pretty much everywhere. What's our reaction to these sobering statistics? Well, people have actually studied that. Richard Hobbs, for one, and he says that our reaction to the loss of biodiversity is very similar to our reaction to the news that we have a terminal disease. We go through 5 stages of grief. First, there's denial, and we certainly have a lot of people denying that we have any problem at all. Then we have anger. I felt a little bit of that. Bargaining, what can we do to make it better? Depression, felt a little bit of that as well. And then this is the one we have to be careful of. We don't want to reach that stage that we call acceptance, because acceptance is equivalent to giving up. And giving up is not an option, because nature is not optional. So we need a 6th step, and that is action to make sure that this doesn't happen. Now, our national parks, we do have national parks, and they were originally created because they were beautiful places. We wanted to preserve the exquisite scenery that is a characteristic of our national parks. And this was pushed by Teddy Roosevelt, who said the establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration, the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenships. In other words, our parks were created because they were pretty places for us to play in. That's what it boils down to. And that's probably because why we only have 12% of the US that is protected in formal parkland like that. There's just not that many places that are exquisitely beautiful that meet that criteria. So 12%, that means we've got, 88% that is not protected. And what's happening outside of our parks has literally been appalling. Every 30 seconds, there's a football field worth of America's natural areas that disappears to development. And development is I think it's the most oxymoronic word in all of ecology. There are 44 million acres of lawn now. That's an area greater than New England. We've paved over an area larger than Ohio. We've got 2 million acres of golf courses. That's an area larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined. So that's okay if you like golf, but the sum effects of environmental destruction sneaks up on us. This was pointed out by Matt Lee Ashley. He says, evaluating the condition of nature is a bit like watching a leaking pipe. If a person focuses on each drop as it falls to the floor, the leak doesn't seem that damaging. But if they leave for a day, They come home and the room is full of water. And that's what's happening. These little bits of destruction here and there are adding up to a big, big problem. Now, you might wonder why biodiversity can't be sustained in the tiny little natural areas that remain. And the answer is they're too small. When you take a large area like this, large habitat like that, and you shrink it down into some fragment of that habitat, you have reduced population size. You've taken large populations and made them small or tiny. And that's the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. In good times, they go up, and in bad times, they go down. If you are a large population, this top line here, even in your down cycles, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly. But if you're a tiny population, often in the down cycle, you actually hit zero. You blink out of your little habitat patch. And unless you can recolonize it, and so many of our animals cannot. Think of a box turtle crossing a busy highway. Think of a monarch crossing a busy highway. Often doesn't happen. So that's the end of that population. That's local extinction. And that's happening everywhere. There are studies all over the world that are showing that our natural areas are really not large enough anymore to sustain the amount of nature that we need them to sustain, because that's creating the life support that we all depend on. Now, we use extinction as a metric of trouble, but I don't think extinction is the right metric. We certainly have extinction out there, but we have to beware about the loss of common species. This is the American chestnut, for example. It dominated our eastern forests from Maine all the way down to Georgia at the turn of the century. And then we brought in a disease and wiped them out. It is the common species that run our ecosystems, not the rare or declining ones. They're no longer numerous enough to perform vital ecological roles. So we lost the American chestnut. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. It's on the brink of extinction. It used to be one of the most common bees in the country. No more. Beavers. Now, beavers are actually on their way back when we allow them to be, but in the old days, beavers were in all of our aquatic systems. They created the hydrology of North America in its entirety. And when we eliminated them, we changed that hydrology totally, not for the better. So it's defaunation. It's the removal of animals from populations. They don't have to be extinct, but there's fewer of them. That is the real problem. It's a local problem. It's everywhere. And it's something we typically don't even notice. We have a problem called shifting baseline. We tend to think that the way things were when we were kids, when we were growing up, is the way they've always been, and that's an okay way. So the kids that are born today are growing up in a world they can walk outside, they don't hear any birds, they don't see any butterflies. That's normal to them, which means they don't miss those things. Even our generation, we don't miss the passenger pigeon. It was the most common bird on the planet because they were gone before we were even born. So shifting baseline means that we are losing biodiversity, the biodiversity that sustains us, without even noticing it. Kind of like the frog sitting in the pot of boiling water. Well, E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson of Harvard, who died the day after Christmas this year, terrible loss to the world of conservation, he knew this his entire career. And he worked on saving biodiversity his entire career. And in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. In trying to turn this around, he said, we're not going to save life anywhere on planet Earth unless we save nature, unless we save functioning ecosystems on half of planet Earth. And then he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He did not spend a lot of time telling us how we could actually do that. Believe it or not, governments are starting to listen to his call for putting aside half the Earth. You've heard of the 30 by 30 global initiative. President Biden talks about, people say it's Biden's initiative. It's really not. It's the UN's initiative. It's step one, so that we're going to save 30% of the Earth by 2030. It's step one towards saving 50% of the Earth by 2050. And that is E.O. Wilson's call. So the UN's talking about it. They're negotiating. but crucial negotiations to protect biodiversity are moving at a snail's pace. I took that from an article not long ago. Can you believe that we have to negotiate whether or not we're going to save our life support systems? Seems unbelievable to me, but that's what the UN does. They negotiate. So the goal is to protect pristine habitat on 50% of the earth. There is a big problem though, and that is we do not have pristine habitat on 50% of the earth. We've got agriculture on 50% of the earth. Terrestrial earth anyway is already in some form of agriculture, hardly pristine. And then we've got 8 billion people, and all of our infrastructure and detritus and airports, all that stuff is in the other half. And we don't have a third half just to put aside for nature. So there isn't 50% of earth still left. So how can we do this? How can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? I actually think we can. I think we can. And that's really what I'm going to talk about. As a matter of fact, I think the answer is obvious. We need a new approach to conservation. The old approach had humans and nature segregated. They had humans here, nature someplace else. We've got to give that up. We've got to give up the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist and come up with a new model where they are coexisting. And I'm going to argue that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head, and we need to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that is most everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Well, if protected areas are not large enough, and they are not, we need to practice conservation outside of those protected areas, outside of the parks and the preserves. In other words, we've got to protect not only these places, but we also have to practice conservation in areas like that. Mary Reynolds in Europe says we've got to change from gardeners to guardians, and that's a particularly relevant message for master gardeners everywhere. But it requires a new mindset. I've got Zoom labels blocking all the things I've written here. Okay, with the notion that we have the right to own a piece of the earth, which you can question. It's worth thinking about. Do we really have a right to own a piece of the earth? But right now we think that we do. But along with that right comes the assumption that we get to do whatever we want with that piece of the earth. And therein lies the problem. It occurred to me the other day that our yards are not like Las Vegas. You have heard that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Some of you might depend on that being true. But that's not true in our yards. What happens in our yards, on our property, does not stay on our property. And that's a message we've got to get across to everybody. Your property, our properties are all part of local ecosystems. So whatever you do on your property impacts the entire ecosystem and everything around you, all the other living things, including other people around you. So let's start with lawn. The amount of lawn you have will determine whether rain infiltrates to your water table, or whether it leaves a stormwater runoff. It's going to determine whether you're adding nitrogen and phosphorus and herbicides and pesticides to your local watershed. It's going to determine whether you're supporting pollinators or not, or whether you're eliminating the resources that they need. How you landscape is going to determine how much carbon your landscape is pulling out of the atmosphere, getting it out of harm's way, and putting in plant tissues, and allowing those plants then actually to pump the carbon, the extra carbon that they fix through photosynthesis into the soil through their root system. Once it's in the soil, it's extremely stable. It's stable for thousands of years. Remember, our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have put there over the eons. We've got to encourage them to do that. Our plant choices in how we landscape are going to determine whether we're harboring ecological tumors like calorie pear, that then escape and ecologically castrate the landscapes around us, the ecosystems around us, or whether we're using the plants that support the food web, that support our insects and support the birds and all the other things that are out there. All of that is determined by how we landscape. In other words, how we landscape is going to determine how much life Earth can sustain. And of course, the more life it sustains, the better off we humans will be. That's an awesome responsibility for gardeners. Very awesome responsibility. You're now in charge of life on planet Earth. Now, fortunately, the biodiversity crisis has a grassroots solution, one that you and I, people all around us, can participate in solving. Let's talk about private property. 78% of the country is privately owned by over 100 million people. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned, again, by an awful lot of people, which means if it's a grassroots solution, we got a lot of people that can help us out here. Collectively, property owners everywhere are now the hope and the future of conservation. We've got the big conservation organizations, and we've had them for a long, long time. It's not working. So now we need to rely on the common folk, you and me. Let's start with lawn. Lawn is the low-hanging fruit in all of this. There's more than 44 million acres of lawn nationwide. That figure has increased 4 million since Malosi et al. In 2005 measured 40 million. But that's an area larger than New England. And I know we need lawn because it's a status symbol, and we need lawn to display our Halloween decorations. But in 2007, when I first heard that figure of 40 million acres, I was wondering what would happen if we cut the area of lawn in half. Well, we could create a new national park. If we did that, we'd be doing it at home. It would give us 20 million acres we could put towards conservation right at home. So we could create a new national park that I am calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonland, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So when we build Homegrown National Park, it'll be the biggest park in the country. Well, I had this idea. I thought it was a cool idea. So I started talking about it in my talks. Then finally, when I wrote Nature's Best Hope, which came out in 2020, I had a chapter called Homegrown National Park. So I wrote about it and talked about it a little bit more. But I was giving a talk in New England, and this woman right here, Michelle Alfanderi, who had just retired from a business career in Manhattan, came up to me and she said, you know, if you don't get beyond the choir, if you don't talk to people who don't already support all of this, it's not going to work. And I said, yeah, I know that. I said, but it's only the choir that invites me. She said, you've got to do social media. You've got to have a website. You've got to create a nonprofit. You've got to do all the things that I said, I don't do. That's, you know, I go out and do the experiments. I don't do all that stuff. She said, but I do that. And I would like to help you really build an organization that we call Homegrown National Park. So she did. Now we have homegrownnationalpark.org. It is a nonprofit. With an emphasis on nonprofit, because we don't charge anybody to join Homegrown National Park. There's no real income. That's an issue. But at this point, what we're doing is inviting people to register their properties on the map. And what that means is you put down your location, the website shows you how to do that, and the amount of area that you are going to be a good steward of. If you really are cutting the lawn in half, you put that area down there. Even if you're reducing the lawn by 4 square feet, you record that. If you're protecting a wood lot in your back, you put that down. If you have an aster in a flower pot on your porch, you can count that. We're trying to change the culture as much as we're trying to actually record land that has been properly managed. And then your little area of your county is going to light up. And we want that message that everybody is responsible for good stewardship of the world, of the US, to go viral. People can watch the map light up. We can all be part of the same team, the same tribe that is saving North America. We got about 10,000 people on the map at this point. So we're moving right along. It's only been up for a little bit less than 2 years. What are we asking? Well, we are asking people to reduce the area in lawn. Lawn really is an ecological deadscape. We want them to put more native plants where that lawn used to be. Remove invasive species that are on your property. They are ecological tumors. and also protect any natural areas that might be part of their property that remain natural. That's all part of what we're asking. Our product is going to be national awareness, increasing that message that that people are responsible for the stewardship of the land they own. Not just to point out what the problems are, but what the solutions are, to change that culture, to build a recognition that nature is not optional, that everybody has a responsibility to sustaining it. And that map will provide measurable conservation progress. We can see how well we're doing as the entire country lights up. The benefits of Homegrown National Park is that it converts hope into action. When we actually do these things, we feel good about it. We can see the results right on the local level. That motivates us to do it more. It's aspirational. We have a big goal, but we're headed in the right direction. It doesn't rely on governmental support. We would love some governmental support, but it doesn't rely on it. It merges all kinds of national conservation efforts, Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, all these groups that are trying to do the same thing. We're going to record that visually so that we can see the progress if all the members of these groups join Homegrown National Park. It'll reveal areas where we have to work harder, where there are holes in our biological corridors that are connecting wild places. All these are benefits of Homegrown National Park. And we're working with a tech company now that is going to build a map. It'll look a lot like the COVID maps we're so used to seeing in the New York Times. Every county is going to be colored depending on how many people are members of Homegrown National Park. This is just an illustration of what it's going to look like. So it's a science-based, grassroots call to action that can address the biodiversity crisis and climate change, because we're going to address the biodiversity crisis by putting a lot of plants back, and that addresses climate change. There's urgency in enacting Homegrown National Park, that conservation solution. And this is why. We've got 135 million acres of residential landscapes. Let's say we added 1,000 acres to Homegrown National Park each month. Sounds like a lot, but at that pace, it'll take us 11,250 years to meet our ultimate goal. We can't afford that kind of a slow build, because I, for one, am not going to live that long. So who's going to build Homegrown National Park? Everybody. Residential property owners, corporate property owners, ecological landscapers, woodlot owners, farmers, land managers, land conservancies. But in order to do this, we've got to improve our nation's ecological IQ. Let's have a brief ecological primer. We throw these terms around all the time, but I have found a lot of people are confused about them. Biodiversity. What the heck is biodiversity? It's all forms of life on planet Earth. We typically record it in terms of number of species, but you could talk about the genetic diversity within those species or within populations. You can talk about ecosystem diversity, all levels of diversity, but we're really talking about the most often measured by the number of species in a particular area of both plants and animals and everything else. What's a habitat? This is where there's the most confusion. People think a habitat is a place to live. And it is, but it's a place that provides everything you need in order to live successfully. So it provides shelter, it provides food, it provides water. So people drive down the road and they see all this green and they say, things are great. We got all that habitat out there. Well, if all that green are plants from China, and in so many places they are invasive species, those places are not supplying the food. They may be shelter and water there, but no food. So it is not good habitat. An ecosystem, it's a community of interacting organisms that are interacting with each other and also their physical environment. And finally, ecosystem services, that's simply the life support that is provided by ecosystems. We always say in terms of its effect on humans, but every living thing out there depends on ecosystem services. So what we have to do is convince everybody, is educate everybody that there are basic responsibilities that are basic ecological goals that every landscape has to accomplish. Every landscape has to support food webs. Every landscape has to sequester carbon. Every landscape has to clean and manage water. They're all in a watershed. There's no landscape that is not in a watershed. And every landscape has to support pollinators. This has to become common knowledge. So everybody must recognize that lawn doesn't accomplish any of those things. We also have to learn that plant choice matters. In the past, we chose plants for what they looked like because making pretty landscapes was our only goal. But we need to recognize that there are three types of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. There are plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there are plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. A great example of a contributor is one of the oaks. As a matter of fact, we can easily make the argument that oaks are the best contributors across the country, wherever they occur, because they are contributing the most energy to local food webs. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia. Nothing eats it, which means it does not contribute energy to the local food web, but it's not invasive, it's just sitting there. And then a great example of a detractor would be a calorie pear, but any of our invasive ornamentals, burning bush, privet, bush honeysuckle, all of those things are degrading local ecosystem function because they don't stay in our yards. Their propagules escape and they displace the native plants that support food webs with themselves that are not supporting food webs. We also have to make it common knowledge that caterpillars are essential components of local food webs because they are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something more often than not is a caterpillar. So if we don't design landscapes that support a lot of caterpillars, we have failed food webs. And we also have to educate landowners that keystone plants are essential because they are supporting the most caterpillars. Remember what a keystone is. It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, it turns out that just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are essential. We've been trying to build ecological houses out of wallpaper, and of course that doesn't work. So now we're going to use those keystone plants, those supports. And we have to also learn that E.O. Wilson was right. Insects are the little things that run the world. He wrote a paper about that in 1987, where he described all the things that insects do that are absolutely essential to our life on planet Earth. We want to learn that 90% of the insects that support local food webs can only develop on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. They are specialists on particular plants, like the monarch is a specialist on milkweed. You can take all the milkweed out of your yard and put in hostas, and the monarch is not going to switch to hostas. It'll disappear when we do that. We have to make the fact that pollinators are necessary everywhere, common knowledge. Which is different from what we hear. I mean, we hear that we need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops. We don't need that kind of anthropocenic justification for pollinators. Pollinators pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is simply not an option. So we need pollinators everywhere, not just next to agriculture. And we also have to convince homeowners that our native ground nesting bees, the ones that would be most common, we've got about 4,000 species of native bees, 1 species of non-native honeybees. So when we talk about pollinators, we're mostly talking about native bees, and 70% of them nest in the ground. They are totally harmless. They are not going to sting us. We also have to learn the value of fallen leaves, of leaf litter. They have an essential ecological role. They are protecting the ground, protecting the moisture that is in our soil that provides the necessary environment for our soil ecosystems. There are more species that live in the soil than live above ground, and they are recycling the nutrients that these leaves are returning to the soil, but only if we leave these leaves in place. Remember that dot line white? If we rake them away, we've not only thrown away all the caterpillars and pupae that are in here, but we've thrown away the nutrients that our plants need. And we've exposed our soil ecosystem to drying out and to erosion and all kinds of nasty things. But people worry, oh, I can't keep the leaves around or it's going to ruin my garden. That really is not true. We can landscape attractively without getting rid of all of our fallen leaves. This is golden seed. Look, there are leaves under there. This is Virginia creeper. It's a great ground cover. Again, grows right over the leaves. Wood poppies, there's countless examples of native plants that come through those leaves just fine in the spring, and you can have attractive gardens without getting rid of those leaves and their vital ecological roles. We also have to learn that there is a real threat from light pollution and, of course, from mosquito fogging to insect populations. These are two of the primary reasons that we have global insect decline. We're killing them all over the place, but in ways that we don't even think about. You know, mosquito fogging doesn't just kill mosquitoes. As a matter of fact, it doesn't control mosquitoes at all. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. But it does kill all the insects that it comes in contact with. We can reduce light pollution issues by taking out the white bulbs that we use in our security lights and replacing them with yellow bulbs because yellow wavelengths don't attract nocturnal insects, or at least far fewer of them. So if we replaced our white bulbs with yellow bulbs, and yellow LEDs are the best, we would save millions of insects overnight, plus millions of dollars because they're LEDs. We also have to learn that conservation is appropriate on any size property. You don't have to own 50 acres to be effective. This is Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. It's 1/10 of an acre, which is 3 times smaller than the average lot size. And it's got high conservation value. You can have effective conservation plants in a flower pot on your balcony. So any size will help, particularly if everybody does it. And most of all, we have to believe that conservation works. So here are just a few examples of how well it does work. Remember that statistic that we've lost 3 billion breeding birds? Well, we have, but that does not apply to our waterfowl because they have actually increased by 54% in that same 50 years that we've lost 3 billion birds. Why? Because we started conservation efforts with waterfowl, primarily by Ducks Unlimited. They spent a lot of time rebuilding habitat and the ducks responded right away. So conservation does work. This is the Nachusa grasslands, 3,800 acres in Illinois. It's got more than 730 native plant species, 180 species of birds. It has bison, and it used to be a cornfield. So we can put it back together again. We can save birds from big trouble. The bluebird is a great example. Private citizens like you and me, bluebirds, of course, nested in isolated snags like this that were very rare themselves. And then, of course, we introduced the starling, which took over those few snags that were there, and the bluebird was in big trouble. But then we figured out we could put up bluebird houses. Luckily, they used them, and it's now, I wouldn't say a booming business, but there are a lot of people with big bluebird trails, and bluebirds are now one of the most common birds in the East because they have responded to our conservation efforts from private citizens. And I'll talk about the conservation effectiveness of what we've done right at my house right here, our house. This is where Cindy and I moved into Oxford, Pennsylvania in 2000, the year 2000. We moved. It was a farm that was broke out up into 10 acres. It'd been farmed for a long time, almost 300 years. The soil was exhausted. The last thing I did was mow it for hay. But it was 3 years out of mowing before we actually built our house. And that's what it looked like when we moved in. That 10 acres was largely covered with, or just about entirely covered with invasives. But there's Cindy getting rid of those invasives. So 10 acres, a lot of people would look at that and say, impossible, we can't do it. Nope, Cindy said we can do it, and she did it. Now it takes constant monitoring because they keep coming back from all the neighbors who didn't do it, but it is totally under control. That's what our front yard looks like now. And I've been taking pictures of all the species of moths that occur in our yard that are now making a living in our yard. Started 5 years ago. And I'm doing that because we have learned through our research that The number of moth species in a local food web is an excellent index of how stable and productive that food web is. So food webs with more moth species support more birds and more of everything else. And so far, I'm up to 1,192 species of moths that are now making a living on this patch of land that was either bare dirt or invasive species not that long ago. So it works because we put the plants back. We got things like the chinkapin leaf miner, the skullcap skeletonizer, the neighbor, they've got some great names. The little devil, the horrid zalie, the obtuse yellow, the explicit arches, and yes, there is an implicit arches as well. The grateful midget, the pink shaded fern moth, the scribbler, the lemon plagotis, the showy emerald, the green marvel, Harris's three spot, the bride, the eyed pectes, the tufted bird dropping moth. And I ask you, who would not want the tufted bird dropping moth in their yard? And of course, and hundreds more species that are out there. And you might say, well, they're going to eat all the plants that you have, but they're not, because we have an awful lot of things that eat moths that are keeping those moth populations in check, including 60 species of birds that breed on our property, not fly by. Those moth species are bird food. And those birds are eating hundreds of moths every single day, hundreds of caterpillars for the most part every single day. So I have to look hard to find any of them. There's also lots of invertebrate predators out there. We've got balanced ecosystem. We've got ambush bugs. We've got assassin bugs. We've got predatory stink bugs. This is the milkweed caterpillar and an early instar on milkweed. And this was a penitomid stink bug that sat there and ate one a day until there were very few by the time they matured. We've got lots of hymenopteran parasitoids keeping those caterpillar populations in check. We've got predatory wasps that are feeding them to their young. We've got a balanced ecosystem. And of course, the vertebrates that eat lots of insects as well, like skunks and possums and raccoons and foxes. 25% of a fox's diet is insects. And we've got them in my front yard because we've got plenty of things for them to eat. Plus, we've got amphibians, we've got toads, we've got frogs, we've got salamanders, we've got box turtles. They're not eating that many insects, but they're eating the slugs. They love those slugs. We've got several species of snakes, including the very cute ringneck snake, and it is eating insects. And the cutest little gray tree frogs, but are green when they're little, that you've ever seen. Okay, but the problem is, the area that's in lawn is probably not going to be enough. We've got 1.9 billion acres in the lower 48 states. That's what the 48 states area is. And less than 12% of it, or 228 million acres, are protected. That leaves 1.6 billion acres that is unprotected. Well, 78% of the US is privately owned, or 1.3 billion acres is privately owned. And if Homegrown National Park restores 20 million acres, our original goal on private property, that's only 1.53% of what needs to be restored. So the lawn is not enough. Our lawn goals are too modest. Now, most of our privately owned land is in small woodlots, believe it or not, or cropland or rangeland. There are 406 million acres of woodlots managed by private citizens, not logging companies in the US. That's a big chunk of land. 738,000 private forest landowners in Pennsylvania alone, and they're controlling 11.5 million acres in Pennsylvania alone. So how they control that acreage is going to depend on the conservation success of all of that land. Now, a lot of those lands are managed for lumber. But you can, there's lots of foundations. This is a good one in Pennsylvania, the Foundation for Sustainable Forests. Sustainable logging is the way to do it. There's two ways you can log a forest. High grade logging, where you take the best and leave the rest, or worst first logging, where you you don't take the best, you leave them and take the trees that are of lesser quality. When you high grade harvest, you get a good harvest once. And that's the end of it for about 100 years. Worst first selection, you get smaller, but much more frequent harvest, and it leads to higher yields indefinitely over time, plus an intact forest with very high ecological integrity. So how we harvest our wood is going to make a huge difference in the biodiversity value of our woodlots. And that includes managing the invasive plants that are throughout our woodlots. We're going to do that by not just getting rid of them, but we've got to control deer as well, because it is overpopulations of white-tailed deer that is encouraging the invasiveness of those plants, believe it or not. Because of course the deer don't like those non-native plants. They won't eat autumn olive or multiflora rosa or all those other things. They eat the baby oak and the natives that come up first. So it tips the competitive balance against our native plants. If you fence out the deer, you have good regeneration, but if you don't, not much there. And there's new research that is showing that overpopulation of deer is encouraging stiltgrass, Asian jumping worms. Some of the very worst invasives that we have are associated with deer populations. What about cropland? 410 million acres in the US that are now in some form of cropland, and that's what it looks like. Well, those areas are pretty much biological deserts right now, but there's 4 things we can do to really increase the biodiversity value of those landscapes. And of course, all those areas could be a national, homegrown national park. We want to manage the roadsides. We want to put back hedgerows wherever we can, put in prairie strips, and limit our use of neonicotinoid insecticides. This is the standard roadside management ethic right now across the US. We've gotten rid of the, quote, weeds that used to support diverse populations of important creatures like our native bees and like our monarch. The monarch has crashed, and by the way, it was just listed as an endangered species by the IUCN because we've gotten rid of its forage that it uses on the way to Mexico, things like asters and goldenrod, and of course the milkweeds that support its reproduction. Same story for most of our native bees. So instead of this, we have this as an option. This is Iowa. Iowa is putting back a lot of its native prairies along its roadsides. A great idea. Prairie strips. Prairie strips are strips of prairie plants right in the middle of our corn and our soybeans. And more farmers are realizing the benefits of this type of farming. And the benefits are many. It supports pollinators. It reduces topsoil loss by 95%, reduces water pollution by 90% because they're planted perpendicular to the flow of water, so it captures runoff and all those nutrients and soil that usually just wash away. And you can put this in. It does take a little bit of the grower's land, but you get support from USDA CRP programs. So lots of ecological value there. And it doesn't cost that much. Putting back our hedgerows is a great idea, but they should be multi-species native hedgerows, not hedgerows of autumn olive. We did a study a couple of years ago looking at the comparing the value of native hedgerows versus hedgerows that are invaded by autumn olive and lots of other things in terms of their ability to make those all-important caterpillars. And we compared the caterpillars in an invasive hedgerow with caterpillars with uninvaded hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And we found that when the hedgerows are invaded, they produce 68% fewer species of caterpillars, 91% fewer caterpillars themselves, and 96% less caterpillar biomass, the energy that's flowing through those hedgerows. So when you have hedgerows, they've got to be native plants or they're going to be essentially inert. And we want to avoid neonicotinoid seed coatings as much as we can. You know, this doesn't even count. It's not even considered the application of an insecticide, even though seeds everywhere now are covered with it. Neonicotinoids are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was, believe it or not. And they're used preventively. So you put them in your crop, whether or not you have an insect problem. And time again, studies have shown that they do not actually increase yield. We're using them for nothing, in other words. And only 5% of the neonicotinoid product is taken up by the plants when they're used as a seed coat. The other 95% enters the watershed where it's extremely persistent or is carried away on dust where it's killing grasshoppers and lots of other things away from the fields. So not much good to say about neonicotinoid. It also drives the pollinators crazy, by the way. Rangeland, 770 million acres of rangeland, 4.5 times the size of Texas. You can manage range in a very productive way. Of course, we had, I don't know how many millions of bison that were on our rangelands in a very sustainable way. We can have cattle there too, but we have to avoid overgrazing, and we have to keep the cows out of the streams. This is a experimental range in Nebraska that Cindy and I visited. Look at these are all sunflowers. Those are cattle. It was not overgrazed at all. All the birds were there. This is entirely possible. But this is the big one. Keep the cows out of the streams. Then the willows and cottonwoods regrow. Those are the keystone species in those western rangelands. And it really brings back the biodiversity. Now, there's something that's common to each one of these conservation approaches. Whether or not they succeed depends on the decisions that you and I make. I had a student last year in one of my classes who wrote this in a paper, and I thought it was right on the money. She said, while conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats, what we're really managing is people. That's what's going to spell the success or the failure of our conservation efforts, is the people that can enact them or refuse to. So we're talking about changing our culture from an adversarial approach to nature to a collaborative one. Can we do this? Well, I think we can. And if we do, it doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live or where you farm or where you work by joining Homegrown National Park. It empowers each one of us. You know, the earth has huge problems. And a lot of people feel absolutely powerless about it. What can one person do? One person can join Homegrown National Park. One person can shrink their lawn. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can replace their outdoor lights with yellow bulbs. One person can use keystone plants. There's lots of things one person can do to increase the ecosystem value of their yard. And then they will enhance their local ecosystem instead of degrading it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire Earth's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can impact. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, you can still help people who do. You can volunteer and be a really important source of labor for conservation. Aldo Leopold, probably we can easily call him the father of modern conservation. One said that there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. Then we know what he was talking about. He's really talking about a mindset. But I'm going to argue that no one can live for long without wild things, because it's the wild things that keep us alive. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Doug. We have a few questions, and I'm just going to get right to them. The first one is, what do you suggest for rabbit-proof lawn alternatives?
Rabbit-proof lawn alternatives. You know, I don't have a rabbit. What I suggest is foxes. if you can manipulate them. We don't have a rabbit problem. We've got rabbits, but our real problems come from deer. You know, the easiest way to reduce lawn, particularly in this part of the country, is not with herbaceous plants that rabbits really love, but with woody plants. So put more trees in your property. And once you, and I fence them to keep the deer out in the beginning. But after not very long, you can remove the fences and the rabbits can't hurt them at that point. Having enough habitat for your rabbits so that the few growing things in your yard is not the only thing that's there is another good way to prevent devastation from rabbits. I know that they can be a problem, but planting plants that rabbits don't like is not the solution. It's the same story with deer. Everybody wants deer-proof plants, and there are a few of them, but deer-proof plants are largely insect-proof plants too, and then you have a failed food web again. So we want to get the important plants out there, and those are the things that things like to eat. But if we have enough of them, then the herbivores that are there, including the vertebrate herbivores, won't overwhelm them.
Okay, the next question, moles, voles, rabbits, should we just leave them to nature?
Yes, but again, we're talking about a balanced food web. You've got to have predators of those things, or they will get out of whack, just like the deer. But if you wipe them out, you will never get the predators. So I would say tolerate them as much as possible. You know, if you're planting trees and they're young, you don't want a lot of mulch right next to the base of the tree. You don't want a lot of vegetation right next to the base of the tree during the wintertime, because the voles will go up and they'll chew on the bark. They'll girdle it over the winter. I've suffered from that a couple of times. Lost, you know, when you start with a beech seedling and you get it 5 feet tall and then a vole girdles it and kills it, that makes me angry. But if you keep it a little bit separated from the base of the tree, that doesn't happen. Otherwise, you know, voles and field mice, white-footed mice are an extremely important part of the food web. That's what's supporting our hawk populations and our owl populations. So eliminating them starts unwinding that balanced ecosystem that we're talking about.
Okay. Is there any way to reduce the number of calorie pairs along the highways?
Well, sure. Get out there with your saw and then paint the stump. That is most of that highway land, you know, it's bordering private property. If everybody who owns that private property cleared it out and managed it, we would have far less. We do have public property that's thoroughly invaded, but we're trying to reduce the seed rain that comes down on our private lands from all of these huge invasions. And the only way to do that is to get rid of those plants. So, you know, I'd love to see, I've often thought about, we have prison labor walking along the highways picking up garbage. Maybe they could be cutting down calorie pairs too, something that's really productive. But of course, we don't want to be selling those plants at the same time we're trying to get rid of them. That makes no sense at all. So, you know, people are putting bans on calorie pair, but we should think about all the invasives that way. You know, privet and English ivy and burning bush and all the things that are causing the bush honeysuckle, porcelain berry, the things that are taking over our natural areas. They all, to sell them makes no sense at all.
Okay, next question is, do the yellow lights interfere with bird migration?
Well, lights in general, but you know, it's not the lights on low buildings. It's not your front porch light. It's the lights on those skyscrapers that really clobber the birds. So whether birds are less influenced by yellow versus white light, I don't know. But I suspect it's the tall lights that are, and you know, very bright lights that are causing the big problems. The biggest problem with residential bird kills is our windows. Those are window strikes, and it's not the light on that causes those window strikes. It happens during the day. So putting up bungee cords and some of the other things that are recommended to reduce those window strikes, we lose 1 billion birds a year to window strikes. So that's where the birds are really getting clobbered.
Wow. The military are a very large landowner in this area. What success have you had with convincing the Department of Defense with your ideas?
Well, I have not talked to the Department of Defense, but you know what? They actually have a pretty good record. The military bases around the country, in many cases, are the only place that some of our endangered species remain. The Regal fritillary in Pennsylvania, the only place in the east where it remains is at Fort Indiantown Gap, and they manage it really effectively. They have public tours to go see the butterfly. I went and saw it again this spring, and they were everywhere. It was really new. It was extremely successful. So conservation and military bases they can go hand in hand because they control a lot of land. So that has not been on my radar. Maybe it should be, but they're already doing a pretty good job in an awful lot of places. So,
okay. What can homeowners do about Asian jumping worms?
Huge problem. Be very careful about the plants that you buy. Know where you buy them. When you buy a bald and burlap tree, for example, where did it come from? You could say, well, there's no worms in the soil here, but there could be egg cases. The Asian jumping worms are are annuals. They don't overwinter, and they lay these egg cases that are in the soil. You'll never know they're there. So bringing in a tree from a place that has jumping worms is that's what you've got to avoid. Of course, the best way to avoid that is plant a seed, and then you have no jumping worms. But they're a huge problem. They're a huge problem because they eat all that valuable leaf litter. They eat it. They change the chemistry of the soil. They eat all the seeds in the soil. They really destroy that soil ecosystem. And nobody knows what to do about them. It's just a huge problem.
Okay, what native plants could be effectively planted in the strips of land between the sidewalk and curb, the verge, to encourage pollinators, stormwater absorption, but still look pleasant to the neighborhoods?
Well, any of our native flowering plants will do that. So it depends on how dry is that area, how wide is that area. You better get permission from the township to do it, because a lot of them have regulations that it can only be lawn. We're trying to reduce those, but there are plenty of options. You want something that's pretty low growing, so it's not going to flop over on the sidewalk itself. Violets. People consider them weeds. They're beautiful. They're very low growing. They support, I don't know, at least 13 species of specialist bees that can only reproduce in the pollen of violets. So something low like that would be a great alternative for a space between the sidewalk and the street. This is where I say I'm an entomologist, and I rely on you master gardeners to find the perfect plant mix that will work well in a situation like that. And then publicize it, let people know. Do some experiments, figure it out, try it out. It's a perfect goal for master gardeners.
Another question, can we share this presentation with our friends and neighbors?
Please do.
Okay, great. Let's see. How do we change the aesthetics that are expected by so many people? And that is probably the biggest question. Everybody seems to think that these are weedy plants and we don't want weeds in our yards.
Right. Well, notice I don't say get rid of lawn. I say reduce it. The lawn you keep should still be mowed, still be manicured. It's a cue for care. It still falls within the realm of our the social norm that we have. You've got manicured lawn. You're just going to have less of it, and you're going to have more plants in your yard. So I'm not saying just stop mowing and abandon everything and let everything look like a pile of weeds. That's not what we're suggesting. We call lawn a cue for care. When you're maintaining it along the sidewalk or a strip along your driveway, it shows that whatever's beyond that is an intentional landscape. So that is the best way to increase the amount of plants in your yard, is by maintaining the care of that lawn. I would suggest you don't need the fertilizer. Most fertilizers have a broadleaf herbicide in them. You don't even know it. And you're putting it on to make sure you kill all the clover and anything else that might be beneficial in your lawn. If you keep your lawn mowed, it will, particularly at a little bit of a distance, it'll look just fine. It may not win Lawn of the Month award, but that's okay. It'll be good enough that you can fit in with the cultural norm, and you're making your yard much more ecologically healthy.
Here's a good one. Will there be any way to get rid of roadside kudzu?
Well, there's one of our worst invasives. We brought it in to stabilize soil. Like we had no native plants that would stabilize North American soil. We had to bring in kudzu. Kudzu has enormous roots. The central root system of a kudzu plant is like an 80-gallon drum. It goes down into the ground, and it really takes a backhoe to dig it up. And it does grow very rapidly, and then will root along as it goes. So huge problem. Mowing repeatedly will control it, and repeatedly until you exhaust the energy in that root system. Or again, herbicides. These are poor alternatives, but leaving it to go crazy is a very poor alternative as well. People say, well, I'm never going to use any herbicides, but I think of herbicides as like chemotherapy. So you've got a tumor in your body. You can let it go. You say, I'm not going to use chemotherapy. Okay, well, you know what happens when that happens. But or you can put that poison in your body and try to kill the tumor before it kills you. That's what we're doing with these herbicides. They've got to be used correctly, and they've got to be used, thoughtfully, not overused. But it's a tool in our management toolbox. And I don't have any kudzu on my property, so I don't have personal experience with managing it. But a lot of people in the South do. So I would consult some experts about the best way to control it. But control it, that's the goal.
Is there any way to get rid of chiggers in your natural area of your yard?
Boy, I wish you'd ask me some questions I could answer. Chiggers are mites that are part of our ecosystem. So I don't know of any way to get rid of chiggers that doesn't kill everything else. The best way is to manage that risk. Don't go out in your yard and lay down. Chiggers they like to get up on wooden benches. If you go and sit on a bench in your favorite park at the right time of year, you often can get chiggers. So managing how you conduct yourself in your landscape will help. And certain times of the year are certainly worse than others. Sulfur. You can get sulfur powder. You put it around your ankles where your socks are and maybe your waistband. That keeps the chiggers off. But killing all the chiggers in your yard, there's just no way to do that without just eliminating life everywhere that I know of.
Okay. Are the solar farms taking over much habitat nationally?
Well, they're taking a lot of acreage. So again, this is a trade-off. We want green energy, but they are looking for ways. Many of these farms are looking for ways to enhance pollination habitat while they have the solar panels. And I've heard there's some big successes there. Those solar panels in the big farms are a couple feet off the ground, and they don't totally block all the sunlight. So you can have really increase pollinator habitat if managed properly, and a couple big grants out looking at that. So I'm going to say yes, they can. I have heard reports of places in Rhode Island that are cutting down oak forests to put in a solar farm. Bad idea. Oak forests are harboring a lot of carbon. They're pulling it out of the atmosphere. They're high biodiversity value. That's the last thing you want to do. But if you're converting farmland or something where the bulk of the vegetation is already gone, it's a good alternative.
Okay, and then we've got one more question, and that is, do you have a Homegrown National Park brochure or flyer that could be duplicated to hand out at the public, like at farmers markets or some of the events that we go to?
There is one on the website. You can download it and print it out.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Good question.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn this over to Will, our president. Thank you.
You are welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Tallamy, for a fantastic presentation. We are so appreciative that you spent this time with us, and we will get the message out the best we can. And I also want to thank our fellow Master Gardeners in Suffolk, Portsmouth, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach for joining us. Great to have you guys, and hopefully we'll see you in November for Kathleen Reed's talk. So thanks